This is day 53. It's the history of by taking on a challenge like that. But ironically, as Fogg is in so much of a hurry and a rush to get to the Reform Club in 80 days to win his bet, he really hardly sees any of the cities he travels through. Just like Shanghai, where he stops for just long enough to get off the steamer he took from Hong Kong, just so he can catch the next one from Shanghai to Yokohama. And that's a miss that I'm not going to make. And as you've seen throughout my series, half of the action happens in the cities that you pass through. So there's no point in missing that, especially in Shanghai. Shanghai is without doubt one of the most vibrant and dynamic cities in China. It's a city that's steeped in history and culture and tradition, and it's played a key role in the development of China over the centuries. And in this episode, I'm going to explore the complete history of Shanghai and China, from ancient times to the present day. Long before the skyscrapers, Shanghai was a tapestry of fishing villages, woven together by the waters of the Yangtze Delta. These relics bear silent testament to the ingenuity of those early settlers, whose descendants would shape the destiny of this land. The same spirit of grandeur that built the Great Wall runs through the veins of Shanghai, a city that was always seemingly destined for greatness. The history of China dates back to the Paleolithic era, around 2.24 million years ago. And archaeological evidence suggests that humans lived in China during this period, and that they were skilled in hunting, fishing, and gathering. During the Neolithic era, around 5000 BC, China developed its first agricultural communities. They were communities that were based on the cultivation of rice and wheat and other crops. And they formed the basis of China's early civilization. In the Xia dynasty, 2100 to 1600 BC, China's first dynasty was established. The Xia dynasty was followed by the Shang dynasty of 1600 to 1046 BC. Which is known for its bronze metallurgy and its development of a system of writing. The Zhou dynasty of 1046 to 256 BC followed the Shang dynasty. The Zhou dynasty was known for its development of feudalism and for its contribution to Chinese philosophy, including Confucianism and Taoism. Do you remember the American TV series Dynasty? Well, China had many. In China, the word dynasty means quite simply a succession of rulers born from the same family. Beginning with the Bronze Age, Shang Dynasty, historical eras in China have borne the name of the family or clan that dominated during that period. Some dynasties, such as the Zhou and the Ming, lasted for centuries. In 221 BC, the Qin dynasty was established, marking the beginning of Imperial China, and the Qin dynasty was followed by the Han dynasty of 2006 BC to 2020 AD, which is known for its military conquests, its cultural achievements, and its development of the Silk Road. That's the actual trail, not the hard drugs website. The Tang dynasty of 618 to 907 AD followed the Han dynasty, and the Tang dynasty was known for its prosperity, its cultural achievements, and its cosmopolitanism. And during this period, China became a major centre for trade, and the capital city of Chang'an became one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the whole world. The Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, followed the Tang dynasty. And the Song dynasty was known for its development of printing, of paper, of money and gunpowder. And the Song dynasty was also a period of cultural and artistic flourishing, with the development of landscape painting, poetry and ceramics. The Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368 AD, followed the Song dynasty, and the Yuan dynasty was established by the Mongol Empire, and it was known for its tolerance and promotion of trade. During this period, China became part of a larger empire that spanned much of Asia and Europe. The Ming dynasty of 1368 to 1644 AD followed the Yuan dynasty, and the Ming dynasty was known for its restoration of Chinese culture, for its development of the Grand Canal, which helped build or improve communication and trade within China. The Qing dynasty of 1644 to 1911 AD followed the Ming dynasty, and the Qing dynasty was established by the Manchu people who came from the north and conquered China. The Qing dynasty was known for its expansionist policies and its resistance to Western imperialism. Which leads us to modern China. In the 19th century, China faced a series of challenges that would fundamentally alter its history and its relationship with the rest of the world. These challenges included the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the Boxer Rebellion. The Opium Wars opened an era of strife, forcing Shanghai into the global spotlight. It was a pawn in the games of empires. This is one of my many opium pipes. The Opium Wars were a series of conflicts between China and Britain over the illegal trade of opium. And the wars were fought between 1839 and 1860, and they resulted in much change. And contrary to what you may believe, it wasn't the Chinese that were involved in opium, it was the British. Shanghai played a significant role in the Opium Wars, these conflicts between Great Britain and China over the trade of opium. The city was already one of the great treaty ports which was open to foreign trade after the wars, which marked the beginning of Shanghai's transformation into a global hub of commerce and industry. And the Opium Wars, which were started by the British, were a series of conflicts over the lucrative drug trade in mainland China during the 19th century. And despite having greater numbers, China would struggle against the technologically superior British, who were determined to protect their colonial interests. Ultimately, the Opium Wars would cement European hegemony in Asia by opening this once untouchable nation. During the early 19th century, Great Britain was fast becoming the most powerful nation on earth. Blessed with a strong economy and a growing middle class, British people developed a taste for finer things, including porcelain and silk and tea, which were being imported from China. And while the bill for Chinese goods steadily ballooned, the British sold little back to the Chinese in return, and merchants were soon shelling out more silver than they were making. 19th century China was extremely self-sufficient, and they were cautious about opening the borders to foreign merchants. Western visitors were banned from travelling inland, unless officially authorised by the emperor, and all Western trade was funneled through just one port in Canton. Despite these difficulties, many business-minded Westerners were drawn to this huge and potentially lucrative market, and looking to rectify the trade imbalance, and with nothing useful to sell, legions of British merchants resorted to selling illegal opium, which was moved around China via the black market. It was harvested from poppies grown in British India. Opium was officially banned in Britain, and you could only buy it when it was diluted to make laudanum, which was a tincture. And whilst opium smoking was not new in China, it was not yet the massive social ill it would become. And during the 1780s, British merchants struggled to sell even one crate to the Chinese. However, with repeated efforts, the first flowering of widespread addiction steadily increased demand, and soon roaring profits were made off the dangerous drug. Between 1806 and 1807, the Chinese had spent almost 7 million silver dollars on opium. And by the late 1830s, consumption was widespread. A determined Chinese official, the formidable Viceroy Lin Zexu, went on a personal mission to end the addiction crisis. He seized every crate of opium he could get his hands on and wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria, asking that the illegal opium trade be halted. Lin's letter was an attempt to tug on the Queen's conscience. Surely Victoria would not permit Britain merchants to buy spices, tea, silk in exchange for poison. And while Lin never received a reply from the Queen, he introduced new and increasingly harsh measures to deal with the drug trafficking. Opium dealers were sentenced to death, as were officials who turned a blind eye to the trade. And by 1839, the foreign quarter of Canton was locked down in a concerted effort to recover all the opium not already turned over to the authorities. Thousands of smuggled crates were uncovered and destroyed. Troops oversaw the process, and trade was only reopened again under strict controls. Concerned that they would lose all their profits, the British opium merchants sought for compensation for their lost wares. And although the British government agreed to match the impounded goods value, the hard-up merchants also demanded that the Chinese government compensate them for any future losses. China refused, and many angry traders called for Britain to send troops to China. Meanwhile, Viceroy Lin was incensed that many opium smugglers were still finding new, more creative ways to get the drug into China, including sneaking it in through the Portuguese colony of Macau. And in July 1839, tensions finally came to a head when a group of drunken British sailors killed a Chinese villager. When the British arrested the men, they sentenced them to just 6 months of hard labour and did not permit the Chinese to try them in a local court. Viceroy Lin asked the British to hand the men over, but the British knew that, given a chance, the Chinese would execute the sailors. Furious, Lin passed an edict forbidding the sale of food to British nationals. This was an attempt to force them to either cooperate or leave China altogether. And this provocative act was a risky move on the part of the Chinese, who did not yet realise the extent of British naval power. And whilst most of the British immediately fled China, some merchants remained just off the coast, quietly running out of provisions. Concerned for the welfare of those who remained, the British Trade Commissioner demanded that all the Chinese sell them food, and when they continued to resist, he ordered the British to open fire on Chinese ships. This small skirmish, known as the Battle of Kowloon, ended in a stalemate, with the British boats fleeing down the coast to buy provisions. And after a brief, timely, inconclusive engagement at the Battle of Chuanpi, the Chinese government was convinced that they had finally rid themselves of the troublesome English, most of whom had disappeared from Chinese waters. Little did they know, the British Parliament was discussing serious military action, and many fictitious stories about Chinese cruelty began to circulate in British newspapers, encouraging popular support for a war. By June 1840, the British were back, armed with a war fleet, and determined to take punitive measures against a defiant China. After quickly capturing the port of Shanghai, the British moved up and down the coast, annihilating the Chinese Navy in battle after battle. And whilst the Chinese had superior numbers, they were easily outclassed by the British technology, and many Chinese junks or wooden sailing ships were repeatedly blown to pieces by the large steam-powered British gunboats. Not only could these modern warships fire farther than their Chinese opponents, but they could also sail against the prevailing winds and tides, which usually dictated how naval battles were fought. By early 1841, the British had received considerable reinforcements, including a new and formidable steamship, HMS Nemesis, which they sailed down the Pearl River to capture the city of Canton. The Chinese had believed that Canton was relatively safe, as the shallow Pearl River was difficult for boats to navigate. However, the new British ships had been engineered with a low draft, so they could tackle shallow waters even at low tide. And while the British captured Canton relatively quickly, they could not hold the city long with so few men. And agreeing to hand back the city in exchange for cash, the British set up a base in nearby Hong Kong. The British would spend the next year campaigning along the Yangtze River, creating as much disruption as possible. And by the summer of 1842, the Chinese had capitulated, and the First Opium War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. This humiliating agreement opened 5 ports to the British and gave Hong Kong to Britain as a permanent base of operations. China would not get it back until 1997. And then there were the foreign concessions in 1860 to 1949. In the aftermath of the Opium Wars, China became a treaty port, which meant that it was open to foreign settlement and trade. The city was divided into separate concessions for different foreign powers, including the British concession, the French concession, the American concessions. And these foreign concessions became centres of business and culture and nightlife, and were home to a diverse population of Chinese and foreigners. And then there is the rise of the Republic of China in 1912 to 1949. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, Shanghai became the centre of political and cultural life in the new Republic of China. The city played a crucial role in the development of modern Chinese art, literature and film. And there was a hub of political activity and intellectual debate. And then there was the Japanese occupation of 1937 to 1945. During World War II, Shanghai was occupied by the Japanese army. The city suffered greatly during this time, with many residents forced to flee or go into hiding. And then there was the Communist Revolution of 1949. After the Communist Party of China seized power in 1949, Shanghai underwent a period of political and social upheaval. The foreign concessions were abolished and the city's economy was restructured along socialist lines. Rising from the ashes of war and revolution, Shanghai soared, claiming its place as a titan of trade, finance and technology. Today, Shanghai is a kaleidoscope of life. Like New York, it's a city that never sleeps, and a beacon that continues to draw dreamers from every corner of the globe. In 1978, China began a period of economic liberalisation and reform under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Shanghai was one of the cities at the forefront of this process and has since become a global financial and commercial centre. Today, Shanghai is home to some of the world's tallest skyscrapers and is a hub of culture, fashion and technology. In 80 days or 80 seconds, one can only skim the surface of this city's deep waters. But if you listen closely, you can hear the heartbeat of Shanghai, a rhythm that echoes through time, a dance of history and modernity.
In 80 days, adventurer and award-winning filmmaker Paul G. Roberts retraces the global footsteps of Phileas Fogg, hero of Jules Verne's most famous work,